What if I told you that the entire course of human history, every war, every empire, every discovery that shaped our world, might have unfolded completely differently because of something that happened 175 million years ago? Something so fundamental that it determined not just where we live, but how we think, how we organize ourselves, and what we've achieved as a species. Picture this for a moment. Instead of 7 separate continents scattered across vast oceans, imagine waking up tomorrow on a single, massive landmass. No Atlantic Ocean separating Europe from the Americas. No Pacific isolating Asia from the rest of the world. No Indian Ocean keeping Africa distant from Australia. Just one enormous supercontinent where you could theoretically walk from what we now call New York to Beijing, from Cairo to Sydney, from London to Cape Town, without ever crossing a body of water larger than a lake. This isn't science fiction. This is Pangea, and it actually existed. But here's the thing that'll keep you up at night thinking, what if it never broke apart? What if that colossal landmass had remained intact while life evolved, while our earliest ancestors emerged, while human civilization took its first tentative steps? Now, I've spent months researching this scenario, digging through geological studies, anthropological theories, and climate models to piece together what might have been. What I discovered will challenge everything you think you know about human progress, about the rise and fall of civilizations, about the very nature of exploration and discovery. Because when you remove the barriers that oceans create, when you eliminate the isolation that shaped distinct cultures, when you take away the driving force behind some of humanity's greatest achievements, you get a world that's both fascinating and terrifying in its implications. Let me paint you the picture of what we're dealing with here. Pangea, if it had survived, would stretch roughly 10,000 miles from north to south and about 8,000 miles from east to west. That's a landmass so enormous that its very size would create climate patterns unlike anything we see today. The interior regions, thousands of miles from any coastline, would be scorching deserts that make the Sahara look like a tropical paradise. We're talking about temperatures that could regularly exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit during summer months, with virtually no rainfall for vast stretches of the continent. But here's where it gets really interesting. While the center would be this hellish wasteland, the coastal regions would be lush, temperate, and absolutely perfect for human habitation. And unlike our world, where early humans had to cross treacherous waters to reach new continents, every single habitable zone would be accessible by foot. No need for boats, no need for navigation skills, no need for the courage to sail into the unknown. Just walk along the coast, and eventually, you'd circumnavigate the entire world. This fundamentally changes everything about human migration patterns. In our timeline, the peopling of the Americas happened relatively late in human history, maybe 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, and required incredible skill and bravery to cross the Bering Land Bridge or navigate coastal waters. Same with Australia, which was settled around 50,000 years ago by some of the world's earliest seafarers. But in Pangea world, human ancestors could have spread to every corner of the habitable world within just a few thousand years of leaving Africa. Think about what this means for human development. Instead of isolated populations developing distinct characteristics over tens of thousands of years, we'd have had constant genetic mixing from the very beginning. No separate evolution of different physical traits in response to local environments. No development of dramatically different languages in isolation. The entire human species would have been in contact, trading genes, ideas, and innovations from day one. But wait, it gets even more complex when you consider the climate. That massive interior desert wouldn't just be empty space. It would actively shape weather patterns across the entire continent. The coastal regions would experience monsoons of incredible intensity as moisture-laden air from the oceans collided with the superheated air rising from the interior. We're talking about seasonal storms that would make modern hurricanes look like gentle spring showers. These climate patterns would have created natural highways for human migration, but also massive barriers. During certain seasons, entire regions would be completely impassable due to flooding or extreme heat. This would have created a rhythm to human movement, a seasonal pulse that would have influenced everything from when people traveled to when they fought wars to when they planted crops. Now, here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. With no oceans to cross, the entire concept of maritime technology would be foreign to Pangeans. No boats, no ships, no navigation by stars over open water. But don't think this would make them technologically inferior. Instead, all that human ingenuity that went into shipbuilding and navigation in our world would have been channeled into land-based transportation and desert survival technology. Imagine civilizations that developed massive, sophisticated wheeled vehicles capable of crossing thousands of miles of desert. Think of technologies for finding and storing water that would put our modern systems to shame. Picture communication networks that could relay messages across continental distances using systems we never had to invent because we had ships and islands to serve as relay points. The lack of natural barriers would have accelerated technological development in some ways, while completely stifling it in others. In our world, necessity drove innovation. The need to cross oceans led to better ships, better navigation, better understanding of wind and weather. The isolation of different regions led to independent development of similar technologies, creating redundancy and different approaches to the same problems. But in Pangea world, there would be no isolation to drive independent innovation. Once a technology was developed anywhere, it would spread across the entire continent within decades, maybe even years. This would create incredibly rapid technological advancement in some areas, but it would also eliminate the diverse approaches to problem solving that have been so crucial to human progress. Consider the implications for warfare and conquest. In our world, geography provided natural defenses. The English Channel protected Britain from continental invasions. The Himalayas shielded India from northern threats. Oceans kept continents separate and safe from distant aggressors. But in Pangea world, there would be no such natural barriers between different regions. This would fundamentally change military strategy and political organization. Instead of island nations or continent-spanning empires separated by water, you'd have a single, massive theater of conflict where any military innovation or tactical advantage could be immediately copied and countered by neighbors. The result would likely be either constant, devastating warfare or the emergence of a single, unified world government much earlier in human history. The economic implications are equally staggering. Trade routes that took months to traverse by ship in our world would be simple overland journeys. The spice trade that drove so much exploration and colonization would be reduced to regional commerce. There would be no age of exploration because there would be nothing to explore that couldn't be reached on foot. But perhaps most intriguingly, the development of different cultures and belief systems would follow completely different patterns. In our world, geographical isolation allowed distinct cultures to develop their own mythologies, their own explanations for natural phenomena, their own social structures. The diversity of human culture is largely a product of separation and independent development. In Pangea world, ideas and beliefs would spread as rapidly as people themselves. This could lead to remarkable cultural synthesis and shared understanding. Or it could result in devastating conflicts as incompatible worldviews collided without the buffer of distance and time that allowed for gradual cultural exchange in our timeline. The very concept of discovery would be different. There would be no unknown lands across the sea, no mysterious continents to dream about and eventually reach. The entire world would be mappable, reachable, knowable from the earliest days of human civilization. This would eliminate one of the great driving forces of human ambition and achievement, the desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. But hold on, because we're just getting started with the really mind-bending stuff. Let's talk about what happens to human psychology when you remove the unknown from the equation. In our world, the existence of unexplored territories, of lands beyond the sea, has been absolutely fundamental to human motivation and ambition. The promise of something better, something different, something undiscovered has driven explorers to risk everything, has inspired countless innovations, and has shaped the very core of human dreams and aspirations. Remove that element of mystery, that tantalizing possibility of the unknown, and you fundamentally alter human psychology. When early Pangean humans looked toward the horizon, they wouldn't see endless possibility. They'd see more of the same landscape they'd already mapped, already understood, already conquered. This psychological shift would ripple through every aspect of human development in ways we can barely comprehend. Think about it. Some of humanity's greatest achievements in our timeline were born from the desire to reach the unreachable. The development of celestial navigation, the creation of more seaworthy vessels, the innovations in preservation of food and water for long voyages. Even our space program can trace its roots back to that fundamental human drive to explore beyond known boundaries. But in Pangea world, that drive would be channeled in completely different directions. Instead of looking outward toward unknown lands, Pangean humans would likely have become obsessed with looking inward, with understanding and conquering the hostile interior of their continent. The Great Desert at the heart of Pangea would become their ocean, their final frontier. The technological innovations that went into shipbuilding in our world would instead go into creating vehicles and survival systems capable of crossing thousands of miles of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Picture this: massive, wheeled cities that could move seasonally, following the life-giving rains around the periphery of the Great Desert. Think of underground transportation networks that would make our subway systems look primitive, boring through the bedrock to connect distant regions while avoiding the surface heat. Imagine cooling technologies that could create comfortable living spaces even in the heart of that continental furnace, powered perhaps by the very heat differential between the scorching surface and the cooler depths below. The social structures that would emerge from this radically different geography would be unlike anything we've seen. In our world, different continents developed different approaches to governance, different concepts of individual versus collective rights, different relationships between rulers and subjects. These differences emerged largely because of geographical isolation that allowed for independent political evolution. But in Pangea world, political ideas would spread as rapidly as trade goods. A successful governmental innovation in one region would be copied, adapted, or conquered by neighboring regions within a generation. This could lead to remarkable political stability if a particularly effective system emerged and spread, or it could create constant upheaval as different political philosophies battled for dominance across the single, connected landmass. The implications for religion and philosophy are equally profound. In our timeline, different regions of the world developed fundamentally different approaches to understanding existence, morality, and the divine. Buddhism emerged in India, Christianity in the Middle East, various animistic traditions in Africa and the Americas. These diverse spiritual traditions enriched human understanding precisely because they developed in isolation and offered different perspectives on universal questions. In Pangea world, religious and philosophical ideas would have been in constant contact and conflict from the earliest days of human civilization. This might have led to either a single, unified understanding of existence that synthesized the best insights from all traditions, or to devastating religious wars on a scale we can barely imagine, as incompatible worldviews clashed without the moderating influence of distance and time. But here's where things get really interesting. The absence of maritime technology wouldn't just change transportation and trade, it would fundamentally alter humanity's relationship with the natural world. In our timeline, humans learned to read the stars for navigation, to understand weather patterns for safe passage, to work with wind and current and tide. These skills connected us intimately with natural cycles and celestial movements in ways that profoundly influenced our development of mathematics, astronomy, and even our concepts of time itself. Pangean humans would develop a completely different relationship with nature. Instead of learning to work with water and weather, they'd become masters of reading the subtle signs of the desert. They'd develop an intimate understanding of underground water sources, of the patterns of sandstorms, of the behavior of the few hardy creatures that could survive in the continental interior. Their mathematics and science would be shaped by the rhythms of the desert rather than the rhythms of the sea. This would lead to technologies and knowledge systems that would seem almost alien to us. Where we developed instruments for measuring longitude and latitude over vast oceans, they might have developed incredibly sophisticated systems for detecting underground water sources or predicting sandstorm patterns months in advance. Their understanding of geology would far exceed ours, born from the necessity of finding resources in seemingly barren landscapes. The pace of technological development would be both accelerated and constrained in fascinating ways. In our world, technologies often developed independently in different regions, creating multiple approaches to similar problems. The wheel was invented separately in several places. Agriculture emerged independently in different continents. This redundancy was crucial when civilizations collapsed because knowledge was preserved in multiple locations. But in Pangea world, there would be no redundancy. Once a technology was developed, it would spread everywhere almost immediately. This would create incredibly rapid advancement when things went well, but it would also create incredible vulnerability. A single catastrophic event, a plague that targeted the interconnected population, a climate shift that disrupted the carefully balanced systems, could set back the entire human species in ways that would be impossible in our more dispersed world. The very concept of cultural diversity would be fundamentally different. In our timeline, the rich tapestry of human cultures, languages, art forms, and traditions emerged largely because different groups of humans were separated by geographical barriers for thousands of years. This isolation allowed for incredible creativity and diversity of expression. In Pangea world, with constant contact and communication, cultural development would follow entirely different patterns. Instead of thousands of distinct languages evolving in isolation, there might have been pressure toward a single, universal language from very early in human development. Instead of diverse art forms reflecting different environments and experiences, there might have been rapid convergence towards shared aesthetic principles. This isn't necessarily negative, but it would create a fundamentally different human experience. The joy of discovering other cultures, of learning that there are completely different ways of organizing society, of expressing beauty, of understanding the world, might never have existed. On the other hand, the conflicts that arise from cultural misunderstanding, the barriers that different languages and customs create to cooperation and empathy, might also never have developed. The economic systems that would emerge would be unlike anything we've experienced. In our world, long-distance trade was incredibly valuable precisely because it was so difficult and dangerous. Spices, silk, precious metals gained enormous value partly because of the effort required to transport them across oceans and continents. This created the economic incentives that drove exploration, colonization, and much of the technological innovation of the past several millennia. But in Pangea world, with no oceanic barriers, long-distance trade would be routine rather than heroic. The economic systems would likely be based on different principles entirely, perhaps focusing more on the transformation and processing of readily available materials, rather than on the transportation of exotic goods across vast distances. This would create entirely different concepts of wealth, different motivations for economic activity, different relationships between regions. Instead of port cities growing rich from maritime trade, we might see the emergence of desert crossing cities, massive hub settlements at the intersections of major overland routes, growing wealthy by providing services and supplies to the constant stream of travelers crossing the continental interior. The military implications alone would reshape the entire concept of warfare and defense. In our world, natural choke points like mountain passes, river crossings, and straits have determined the outcomes of countless battles. The Thermopylae Pass allowed 300 Spartans to hold off a massive Persian army. The English Channel has protected Britain from invasion for nearly 1,000 years. The Strait of Gibraltar has controlled access between the Atlantic and Mediterranean for millennia. But imagine a world where there are no such natural barriers, where any army, no matter how large, could potentially march in a straight line from any point to any other point on the planet. The strategic implications would be staggering. Traditional concepts of defensive geography would be meaningless. There would be no islands to serve as unsinkable aircraft carriers, no peninsulas to defend, no narrow straits to control. Instead, military strategy would revolve entirely around mobility and supply lines. The civilizations that thrived would be those that mastered rapid movement across vast distances and could maintain supply chains stretching thousands of miles across hostile terrain. This would likely lead to the development of military technologies we never needed to invent, massive mobile fortifications, perhaps, or ways to rapidly construct temporary defensive positions in open terrain. The psychological impact on military thinking would be profound. In our world, defenders often had the advantage because they could choose favorable terrain and force attackers to come to them. But in Pangea world, there would be no natural defensive positions. Every conflict would essentially be fought in open terrain, which would favor mobility, speed, and technological superiority over traditional defensive strategies. This might lead to either an arms race of military technology that would accelerate far beyond what we've seen in our timeline, or it might create pressure for early unification under a single government simply because the costs of constant, unrestricted warfare would be too high for any civilization to bear. But let's think about something even more fundamental: the development of human knowledge itself. In our world, the existence of separate continents created natural laboratories for human development. Different environments posed different challenges, leading to different solutions and different ways of thinking about problems. The harsh winters of Northern Europe led to innovations in heating, food preservation, and seasonal planning that were unnecessary in tropical regions. The island nations of the Pacific developed incredible navigation skills and understanding of ocean currents that were irrelevant to landlocked civilizations. The high altitudes of the Andes produced different agricultural techniques and understanding of physiology than the river valleys of Mesopotamia. All of these different approaches to similar problems created a rich diversity of human knowledge. When these different knowledge systems eventually came into contact through exploration and trade, they could be combined and synthesized to create even more powerful understanding. In Pangea world, this diversity would never have developed. Instead of multiple independent solutions to similar problems, there would be rapid convergence on single approaches. This might lead to faster development in some areas, as the best solutions would spread quickly, but it would also eliminate the creative tension that comes from having multiple competing approaches to the same challenge. Consider how this would affect the development of agriculture. In our world, different regions independently developed agriculture using different crops and techniques suited to their local environments. Wheat in the Middle East, rice in Asia, corn in the Americas, potatoes in South America. Each of these agricultural systems had strengths and weaknesses, and the eventual exchange of crops and techniques between continents dramatically improved food security worldwide. But in Pangea world, agricultural development would likely converge quickly on whatever techniques work best in the specific climate zones of the supercontinent. There might be less diversity in food crops, but also less risk of famine, since successful techniques would spread rapidly to all suitable regions. The same pattern would apply to medicine, engineering, mathematics, and every other field of human knowledge. Instead of the rich diversity we see in our world, there would be rapid standardization. This could lead to incredibly advanced development in some areas, but it would also create systemic vulnerabilities that don't exist in our more diverse world. Now, let's talk about something that might be the most profound difference of all: the development of human consciousness and identity. In our world, the existence of others across the seas has been fundamental to how humans understand themselves. The knowledge that there are people living completely different lives in distant lands has shaped our concepts of identity, belonging, and possibility. The great migrations in our timeline weren't just about finding new resources or escaping conflict. They were also about the fundamental human drive to see what else is possible, to discover new ways of being human. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific Islands, the Vikings who reached North America, the various groups that crossed the Bering Land Bridge, they weren't just moving from one place to another. They were expanding the definition of what it means to be human. In Pangea world, this expansion would happen much faster and in very different ways. There would be no mysterious lands across the water to dream about, no unknown peoples to encounter. Instead, the expansion of human consciousness would be driven by the challenge of mastering the hostile interior of the continent. The great heroes of Pangean mythology wouldn't be sea captains or explorers who discovered new lands. They would be desert crossers, the brave souls who ventured into the burning heart of the continent and returned with knowledge of how to survive in the most extreme environments on Earth. The great stories wouldn't be about voyages across unknown waters, but about journeys across endless wastes where the horizon shimmers with heat and the very air can kill. This would create a fundamentally different human psychology, where we developed a relationship with the mysterious and unknown that lies beyond the visible horizon. Pangeans would develop a relationship with the hostile and challenging that lies at the center of their known world. Instead of looking outward with wonder, they would look inward with determination and perhaps fear. The philosophical implications are staggering. In our world, the existence of the unknown has been central to human spirituality and philosophy. The idea that there might be something beyond our current understanding, something waiting to be discovered, has driven both scientific inquiry and religious thinking for millennia. But in a world where everything is ultimately reachable on foot, where there are no undiscovered lands to inspire dreams of other possibilities, human philosophy might develop along entirely different lines. Instead of being driven by wonder about the unknown, it might be driven by the challenge of mastering the known but hostile. This could lead to philosophical traditions focused on endurance, persistence, and the conquest of extreme challenges rather than on exploration, discovery, and wonder about the mysterious. The great philosophical questions might not be what lies beyond, but rather, how do we survive and thrive in the most challenging conditions possible? The development of science would follow similar patterns. In our world, much of our scientific understanding developed from the need to navigate unknown waters, predict weather patterns for safe passage, and understand the movements of celestial bodies for guidance across featureless oceans. Pangean science would likely be dominated by geology, meteorology focused on desert and heat patterns, and engineering solutions for extreme environments. Their understanding of physics might be far more advanced in areas related to heat transfer, underground water flow, and the behavior of materials under extreme temperature stress. They might never develop the same sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics that our maritime civilizations needed, but they could have incredibly advanced knowledge of thermodynamics and materials science that would seem almost magical to us. But here's something that might blow your mind. The absence of maritime technology might actually accelerate their development of other forms of transportation in ways that would leapfrog our own technological development. Without ships to carry heavy cargo across water, Pangeans would need to develop much more efficient overland transportation. This pressure might lead to the much earlier development of technologies we're only beginning to master today. advanced wheeled vehicles, perhaps even magnetic levitation systems for crossing the smooth surfaces of salt flats. Underground transportation networks that would make our subway systems look primitive. Maybe even early development of flight, driven by the need to scout routes across the featureless desert interior. The energy requirements for this kind of transportation across continental distances would drive innovation in power generation that might put them centuries ahead of where we were at similar points in our development. Solar power would be an obvious choice given the intense sunlight in the desert interior. Geothermal energy might be harnessed from the extreme temperature differentials between surface and subsurface in the continental interior. They might develop a completely different relationship with energy itself, seeing it not as something to be extracted from the environment, but as something to be channeled and redirected from the natural extremes of their world. Instead of burning wood or coal or oil, they might become masters of working with the massive thermal and pressure differentials that would exist in their extreme environment. This could lead to technologies that would seem almost supernatural to us. Systems for moving massive amounts of material using nothing but the natural temperature and pressure gradients of their world. Architecture that channels the extreme heat of the desert surface to power cooling systems in underground cities. Transportation systems that use the rising hot air from the interior to power vehicles crossing the continental distances. The social implications of these technological developments would be equally profound. In our world, technological innovation often created social stratification, with those who controlled the technology gaining power over those who didn't. But in Pangea world, where survival in the extreme interior would require incredibly advanced technology, there might be pressure for much more egalitarian access to life-supporting innovations. You couldn't maintain the kind of rigid social hierarchies we've seen in our world, when everyone's survival depends on access to advanced heat management technology or water-finding systems. This might lead to more cooperative social structures, or it might create new forms of control based on access to the technological knowledge needed for survival. The concept of privacy and individual space would be completely different as well. In our world, geography provided natural privacy. You could always find an uninhabited island, an unexplored valley, a place where you could be alone with your thoughts and away from other humans. But in Pangea world, especially along the habitable coastal regions, there would be nowhere to hide from other humans. The pressure of constant contact, of never being able to escape to truly uninhabited territory, would shape human psychology in ways we can barely imagine. This might lead to the development of much more sophisticated social protocols for managing interpersonal relationships, or it might create constant tension and conflict that would make our world's problems seem trivial by comparison. The implications for human creativity and innovation would be equally fascinating and potentially terrifying. In our world, some of humanity's greatest artistic and intellectual achievements emerge from the collision of different cultural perspectives. The Renaissance happened partly because Greek knowledge preserved in the Islamic world returned to Europe. Jazz emerged from the fusion of African musical traditions with European instruments and structures. The scientific revolution was accelerated by the exchange of ideas between civilizations that had developed different approaches to understanding the natural world. But in Pangea world, this kind of creative collision would happen constantly, everywhere, all the time. Instead of rare moments of cultural fusion, creating explosive innovation, there would be constant, gradual blending of ideas across the entire continent. This might lead to incredibly sophisticated and refined cultural developments, but it would also eliminate the dramatic breakthroughs that come from sudden exposure to radically different ways of thinking. Imagine art forms that evolved continuously across thousands of miles, with styles gradually shifting as you traveled from one region to another, but never experiencing the dramatic stylistic jumps that happen when isolated traditions suddenly encounter each other. Music that developed along continental gradients, with instruments and scales slowly morphing as you moved across the landmass, but never experiencing the revolutionary moments when completely different musical traditions meet and create something entirely new. The development of writing and record-keeping would follow completely different patterns as well. In our world, different writing systems evolved independently. Hieroglyphs in Egypt, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, alphabets in Phoenicia, ideographs in China. Each system had different strengths and weaknesses, and their eventual interaction led to the development of increasingly sophisticated ways of preserving and transmitting information. In Pangea world, writing systems would likely converge much more quickly toward whatever proved most efficient for the specific needs of continental scale communication. There might be incredible advances in information, storage, and transmission, driven by the need to coordinate activities across vast distances without the delays that ocean travel imposed in our timeline. But there's something even more profound to consider about human development in Pangea world. The sheer scale of the habitable regions would create population pressures unlike anything we've experienced. In our world, when population pressure built up in one region, there was always the possibility of migration to new continents, new islands, new frontiers across the water. In Pangea world, population growth would be constrained by the actual carrying capacity of the habitable zones, with no escape valve of undiscovered territories. This would force much earlier development of sophisticated population management strategies, advanced agricultural techniques, and perhaps most importantly, much more complex social systems for managing resource distribution across continental distances. The political structures that would emerge from these pressures would be unlike anything we've seen. Instead of the relatively small nation-states that characterized most of human history in our timeline, Pangea would almost inevitably develop continental-scale political systems. The logistics of managing resources and population across such vast distances would require administrative capabilities that would dwarf anything achieved by the Roman Empire, the Chinese dynasties, or any other large-scale political organization in our world. These continental governments would need communication systems that could relay information across thousands of miles in reasonable time frames. They would need transportation networks capable of moving people and goods efficiently across distances that would take months to traverse. They would need legal and administrative systems sophisticated enough to handle the incredible diversity of local conditions while maintaining overall coherence across the continent. The development of such systems would drive technological innovation in directions we never needed to explore. Advanced optics for long-distance visual communication across the clear desert air. Sophisticated mechanical systems for moving messages and small packages rapidly across vast distances. Perhaps even early development of what we might recognize as telecommunications, driven by the absolute necessity of coordinating activities across continental scales. But here's where things get really interesting from a technological standpoint. The absence of maritime challenges would eliminate entire categories of technological development, but it would create pressures for innovation in areas where we've been relatively primitive. Take metallurgy, for example. In our world, the need to build ships that could withstand the stresses of ocean travel led to advances in metalworking and materials science. But these advances were focused on creating materials that could handle the specific stresses of wind and wave and saltwater. In Pangea world, metallurgy would be driven by entirely different challenges. The need to create materials that could withstand the extreme temperature variations between the scorching desert days and the cold desert nights. The need for metals and alloys that could maintain their properties in the intense heat of the continental interior. The need for materials science that could create structures capable of expanding and contracting with huge temperature swings without losing structural integrity. This might lead to advances in materials science that would put our own developments to shame. Imagine alloys designed to actually get stronger under extreme heat stress, or building materials that could actively regulate temperature by changing their properties in response to environmental conditions. construction techniques that use the extreme temperature differentials as a source of power rather than a problem to be overcome. The architectural possibilities would be mind-bending. In our world, architecture has been largely about creating shelter from weather and providing functional spaces for human activities. But in Pangea world, architecture would need to be much more sophisticated, actively managing the extreme environmental conditions while potentially harnessing them for useful purposes. Underground cities that use geothermal differentials for climate control and power generation. Surface structures that could literally move to follow favorable conditions. Massive mobile buildings that could traverse the continent seasonally. Architecture that integrated so completely with the natural thermal and pressure systems of the environment that the buildings themselves became part of the climate management system for entire regions. The energy implications alone would reshape civilization. In our world, energy has mostly been about extraction, taking stored energy from wood, coal, oil, and using it to power our activities. But in Pangea world, with the massive temperature and pressure differentials created by the continental interior, energy might be much more about channeling and redirecting the constant flows of natural forces. This could lead to a fundamentally different relationship with energy and the environment. Instead of seeing nature as a resource to be exploited, Pangeans might develop technologies that work in partnership with natural systems, channeling the vast energies of their extreme environment for human purposes, while actually enhancing rather than degrading the natural systems. Imagine power systems that use the rising hot air from the desert interior to generate electricity, while simultaneously creating favorable wind patterns for transportation and climate modification. Water management systems that use solar energy to extract moisture from the air, while simultaneously creating cooling effects that make vast areas more habitable. Agricultural systems that use the extreme temperature differentials to enhance plant growth while actually improving soil conditions and water retention. The philosophical implications of this different relationship with energy and environment would be profound. In our world, much of our thinking about progress and development has been shaped by the need to overcome natural obstacles, to dominate and control natural forces. But in Pangea world, progress might be defined by how skillfully you could work with and channel natural forces rather than how completely you could overcome them. This could lead to entirely different concepts of success, wealth, and achievement. Instead of measuring progress by how much you could extract from the environment, Pangeans might measure it by how elegantly you could integrate with natural systems to achieve your goals. Instead of seeing themselves as separate from and in conflict with nature, they might develop philosophies that see humans as part of a larger system that could be enhanced and optimized through intelligent cooperation. The implications for human psychology and spirituality would be equally profound. In our world, much of human spiritual development has been shaped by the sense of being small and vulnerable in the face of vast, unknown forces. The ocean, with its storms and depths and mysteries, has been a powerful metaphor for the divine, the unknowable, the forces beyond human control. But in Pangea world, the great spiritual challenge wouldn't be the mysterious unknown, it would be the extreme known. The desert interior wouldn't be mysterious, it would be mapped and understood, but it would remain incredibly dangerous and challenging. This might lead to spiritual traditions focused on endurance, persistence, and the mastery of extreme challenges, rather than on surrender to mystery and the acceptance of the unknowable. Their concepts of divinity might be less about transcendence and mystery, and more about the incredible forces that exist within the known world. Gods of heat and pressure and endurance, rather than gods of mystery and the unknown. Spiritual practices focused on developing the strength to handle extreme conditions, rather than on developing the wisdom to accept what cannot be controlled. But perhaps, most intriguingly, the constant contact between all human populations would create pressures for religious and philosophical synthesis that we've never experienced. Instead of thousands of years for different spiritual traditions to develop in isolation before coming into contact, all human spiritual development would happen in constant dialogue and conflict with all other approaches. This might lead to incredibly sophisticated and nuanced spiritual traditions that had incorporated insights from every possible human perspective. Or it might lead to devastating religious conflicts as incompatible worldviews clashed without the moderating influence of distance and gradual contact. The development of human identity itself would be fundamentally different. In our world, much of how we understand ourselves has been shaped by the existence of others across the water, people living completely different lives in ways we could barely imagine. The knowledge that human life could be radically different from what we knew created space for individual identity, for the possibility of being different from your immediate community. But in Pangea world, with constant contact and communication across the entire human population, the development of individual identity would happen against the backdrop of knowing exactly how everyone else was living. There would be no mysterious others to inspire dreams of different possibilities, but there would also be no excuse for narrow-minded assumptions about what human life should be like. This might lead to much more sophisticated and nuanced concepts of individual identity, since you would need to define yourself not against unknown others, but against the full spectrum of human possibility that you could directly observe. Or it might lead to much more rigid conformity, since deviation from norms would be immediately visible and comparable across the entire human population. The pace of social change would be unlike anything we've experienced. In our world, social innovations often took centuries to spread between different regions, allowing for gradual adaptation and refinement. But in Pangea world, social innovations would spread as rapidly as any other kind of information, creating constant pressure for adaptation to new ways of organizing human relationships. This could lead to incredibly rapid social evolution, with human societies developing much more sophisticated and effective ways of organizing themselves. Or it could lead to constant social upheaval, as different approaches to human organization competed for dominance without the buffer of distance and time that allowed for gradual adaptation in our world. Consider what this would mean for something as fundamental as the family structure. In our world, different cultures developed very different approaches to marriage, child rearing, inheritance, and family obligations. These differences were preserved by geographical separation and allowed for a rich diversity of approaches to one of the most fundamental aspects of human life. In Pangea world, family structures would be in constant contact and comparison with all other possible approaches. This might lead to rapid convergence on whatever family structures proved most effective. Or it might create constant tension as different approaches competed for dominance without the protection of geographical separation. The implications for gender roles, concepts of childhood, relationships between generations, all of these fundamental aspects of human social organization would evolve in completely different ways when they were in constant contact and comparison with all other possible approaches. But let's think about something even more fundamental: the development of human language itself. In our world, the incredible diversity of human languages emerged from geographical separation that allowed different groups to develop their own approaches to communication. This diversity has been one of humanity's greatest assets, creating different ways of thinking about and categorizing reality. Each language embeds different assumptions about time, space, causality, and relationship. The existence of thousands of different languages has preserved thousands of different ways of thinking about fundamental aspects of reality. When these different linguistic approaches come into contact, they can create new insights and understanding that wouldn't be possible within any single linguistic framework. But in Pangea world, the pressure for communication across vast distances would likely lead to much earlier convergence on shared languages. Instead of thousands of different approaches to organizing thought and communication, there might be pressure toward a single highly efficient system that could facilitate coordination across continental distances. This might lead to incredibly sophisticated and precise communication systems, but it would also eliminate the cognitive diversity that has been so crucial to human intellectual development. The different ways of thinking that are embedded in different languages might never develop, creating a more unified but potentially less creative approach to understanding reality. The loss of linguistic diversity might be compensated by other forms of cognitive development, however. The constant pressure to coordinate activities across vast distances and extreme environments might lead to much more sophisticated development of other cognitive skills. Spatial reasoning, long-term planning, systems thinking, the ability to hold complex relationships in mind across multiple timescales. Pangean humans might develop cognitive abilities that would seem almost supernatural to us. The ability to navigate and coordinate across continental distances, to plan and execute projects that span decades and involve millions of people, to understand and work with complex systems that involve multiple feedback loops across vast scales of space and time. But they might also lose cognitive abilities that we take for granted, the flexibility that comes from being exposed to multiple ways of organizing thought, the creativity that emerges from the collision of different linguistic and cultural frameworks, the resilience that comes from having multiple backup approaches to fundamental problems. As we dig deeper into this thought experiment, one thing becomes crystal clear. We're not just talking about a different version of human history. We're talking about a completely different species of human consciousness, shaped by challenges and opportunities that we can barely imagine. The humans who would evolve in Pangea world wouldn't just have different technologies and different social structures. They would have different minds, different ways of processing reality, different relationships with time and space and possibility. They would be recognizably human in their basic biology, but alien in their psychology and their approach to existence. And that raises the ultimate question. Would these Pangean humans be better adapted to survival and flourishing than we are? Would their continental scale cooperation and their mastery of extreme environments make them more resilient and successful as a species? Or would their lack of diversity and their missing relationship with the unknown make them more vulnerable to catastrophic failure? There's no easy answer, because we're comparing two completely different approaches to being human. But as we'll see when we dig even deeper into this scenario, the trade-offs become even more complex and fascinating when we start to consider how Pangean civilization would handle the ultimate challenges that face any intelligent species: the development of advanced technology, the management of population and resources, and the question of what lies beyond their world when they finally turn their eyes toward the stars. The question of how Pangean humans would ultimately fare brings us to perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this entire thought experiment. What happens when a continental civilization finally looks up at the night sky and realizes there are other worlds to explore? In our timeline, the transition from terrestrial to space exploration was natural, almost inevitable. We'd already mastered ocean crossing, developed navigation by the stars, learned to work with wind and weather and the physics of moving through fluid mediums. When we finally developed rocket technology, we were essentially applying knowledge we'd gained from thousands of years of maritime experience to a new medium. But Pangean humans would approach space exploration from a completely different foundation. They would be masters of extreme terrestrial environments, experts in working with massive temperature differentials, specialists in moving heavy loads across vast distances using land-based transportation. Their entire technological foundation would be built around different principles than ours. This might actually give them significant advantages in space exploration. Think about it. The challenges of space travel aren't really that similar to the challenges of ocean travel. The vacuum of space, the extreme temperature variations, the need for completely self-contained life support systems, these are much more similar to the challenges of crossing vast desert wastelands than they are to sailing across water. Pangean humans, with their thousands of years of experience creating self-contained environments capable of sustaining life in the most hostile conditions on Earth, might be far better prepared for space travel than we were. Their expertise in thermal management, in creating closed-loop life support systems, in building structures that could withstand extreme environmental stresses, all of this would translate directly to spacecraft design. But here's where it gets really interesting. Their motivation for space exploration would be completely different from ours. We were driven partly by the same curiosity about the unknown that had led us to cross oceans and discover new continents. Space was just the next frontier, the next unknown territory to explore and potentially colonize. Pangean humans wouldn't have that same relationship with exploration and discovery. They would know their world completely, would have mapped every inch of it, would have no experience with the joy of discovering new lands or the excitement of the unknown. So why would they want to go to space at all? The answer might be purely practical. With their entire civilization confined to a single continent, they would eventually face resource limitations that we've never had to confront. In our world, when one region becomes overpopulated or depleted, there's always been somewhere else to go. New continents to settle, new resources to exploit, new frontiers to expand into. But Pangean civilization would eventually hit the absolute limits of what their continent could support. No matter how sophisticated their recycling systems, how efficient their resource management, how advanced their technology, there would come a point where continued growth would be impossible without finding new resources beyond their world. This would create a very different motivation for space exploration than the curiosity-driven expansion that characterized our own space program. Pangean space exploration would be driven by absolute necessity, by the survival needs of a civilization that had exhausted the expansion possibilities of its own world. This difference in motivation would shape every aspect of how they approach space technology. Where our early space programs were largely about prestige, exploration, and scientific discovery, theirs would be entirely focused on practical colonization and resource extraction from the very beginning. They might skip right past the experimental phases that characterized our space development and move directly to building massive, permanent installations capable of supporting large populations. Their first space stations might be the size of cities, designed not for scientific research but for industrial production and permanent habitation. Their approach to planetary colonization would be similarly practical and large-scale. Where we've been thinking about sending small groups of pioneers to Mars, they might be planning to relocate entire populations to other worlds as quickly as possible. Their experience in managing continental-scale logistics and supporting millions of people in hostile environments would translate directly to the challenges of interplanetary colonization. But this practical approach might also limit their space exploration in some ways. Without the curiosity-driven desire to explore for its own sake, they might focus entirely on the most practical targets, the planets and asteroids that offered the most immediate resources, while ignoring scientifically interesting but economically useless destinations. They might never develop the kind of pure scientific space exploration that has been so important to our understanding of the universe. No Voyager missions to explore the outer planets just to see what's there. No Hubble telescope to look deeper into space purely out of curiosity. Their space program might be entirely utilitarian, focused only on what could directly benefit their civilization's survival and growth. This would create a fascinating trade-off. They might achieve practical space colonization much faster and more effectively than we ever will, but they might also miss out on many of the scientific discoveries that come from curiosity-driven exploration. The social implications of their space expansion would be equally profound. In our world, space exploration has mostly been about small groups of highly trained specialists pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But Pangean space expansion would necessarily be about moving entire populations, entire civilizations, to new worlds. This would require social and organizational capabilities that we've never had to develop. How do you maintain cultural continuity when you're relocating millions of people to completely alien environments? How do you prevent the fragmentation of your civilization when different groups are separated by interplanetary distances? Pangean civilization would need to solve these problems to survive, and their solutions would likely be far more sophisticated than anything we've contemplated. They might develop forms of government and social organization specifically designed to maintain coherence across interplanetary distances. Communication systems that could maintain cultural and political unity even when physical travel between worlds takes months or years. But here's where the fundamental differences in Pangean psychology would really matter. Remember, these are humans who evolved in a world without the unknown, without the mystery of unexplored territories. Their entire cultural and psychological framework would be built around mastery of known but challenging environments, rather than discovery of unknown possibilities. When they finally encountered truly alien environments on other planets, environments that couldn't be understood through extension of their terrestrial experience, how would they react? Would they have the cognitive flexibility to adapt to genuinely novel situations? Or would their lack of experience with the unknown make them rigid and unable to cope with truly alien conditions? This could be the ultimate test of the Pangean approach to human development. Their mastery of extreme terrestrial environments might make them incredibly effective at colonizing worlds that were similar to what they knew. Desert planets, worlds with extreme temperature variations, environments that required sophisticated life support and resource management. But what would happen when they encountered something genuinely alien? Worlds with completely different atmospheric compositions, gravitational fields that required new approaches to movement and construction, ecosystems based on biochemistry they'd never encountered? Would their systematic, practical approach to problem-solving be sufficient? Or would they need the kind of creative, exploratory thinking that comes from experience with the genuinely unknown? The answer to this question would determine whether Pangean civilization could successfully expand beyond their original world, or whether they would be trapped by the very mastery that had allowed them to thrive on their home continent. But let's consider an even more profound possibility. What if Pangean humans, with their different approach to technology and their different relationship with extreme environments, developed space exploration capabilities that were fundamentally different from ours? Instead of the rocket-based approach that we've used, they might develop space access technologies based on their expertise with thermal and pressure differentials. Imagine launch systems that used the massive temperature gradients of their world to power spacecraft into orbit, or space elevators that were essentially extensions of the underground transportation networks they'd developed for crossing their continent. Their spacecraft might be designed like mobile cities rather than like the cramped capsules that have characterized our space program. With their experience in creating self-sustaining environments in hostile terrestrial conditions, they might build spacecraft that were essentially miniature versions of their desert-crossing cities, capable of supporting large populations for extended periods while traveling between worlds. This could lead to a completely different model of space colonization. Instead of sending small groups of pioneers to establish bases that would gradually grow into settlements, they might send entire cities, complete populations with all the social and economic structures needed to establish immediate, large-scale civilization on new worlds. The implications for interstellar expansion would be staggering. While we're thinking about generation ships that might carry a few thousand people on centuries-long journeys to other star systems, Pangean civilization might build interstellar cities capable of carrying millions of people and maintaining complete civilizational continuity during the journey. But this raises another fascinating question. Would Pangean civilization even be interested in interstellar expansion? Their entire cultural framework would be built around mastery and optimization of known environments. The idea of spending centuries traveling to completely unknown star systems might be fundamentally incompatible with their psychology. They might instead focus on completely transforming and optimizing their local solar system, turning every planet and moon into perfectly managed environments that could support maximum population and resource production. Instead of spreading to other star systems, they might create a single, incredibly sophisticated interplanetary civilization that could support populations and achieve levels of technological development that we can barely imagine. This could lead to a completely different model of advanced civilization, where we tend to think of expansion and exploration as signs of civilizational success. Pangean civilization might achieve success through intensive development and optimization of limited space. They might develop technologies for completely re-engineering planetary environments, turning barren worlds into perfectly optimized habitats. They might master asteroid mining and space-based manufacturing on scales that would dwarf anything we've contemplated. They might create artificial worlds that were more suitable for human habitation than any natural planet. In the end, Pangean civilization might achieve a level of technological mastery and population support that would make them far more successful than our own civilization, but they would achieve it through completely different means and with completely different values. The question of whether this alternative path would be better or worse than our own is ultimately unanswerable, because it depends on what you value most about human existence. The diversity and creativity that comes from exploration and discovery, or the security and optimization that comes from mastery and intensive development. But one thing is certain: the humans who might have evolved in Pangea world would be recognizably human in their basic drives and needs, but alien in their approaches to solving the fundamental challenges of intelligent life. They would show us that there are completely different ways of being human, different paths to success and flourishing that we've never had to consider. And perhaps most importantly, they would demonstrate that the specific history that led to our current world wasn't inevitable. The way we think, the technologies we've developed, the social structures we've created, all of these emerged from specific geographical and environmental conditions that could have been completely different. Understanding this alternative path doesn't just help us imagine different possibilities for human development. It helps us understand what's truly essential about human nature versus what's merely contingent on the specific conditions we happen to face. And that understanding might be crucial as we face our own future challenges and consider what paths are still open to us as a species. The story of Pangea World isn't just a thought experiment about alternative history. It's a mirror that helps us see our own world more clearly, and a compass that might help us navigate toward futures we haven't yet imagined. As we reach the end of this extraordinary journey through the world that never was, I want you to sit with something that might fundamentally change how you see your own life, your own choices, your own place in the vast sweep of human history. Everything we've explored tonight, from the scorching deserts that would dominate the heart of Pangea to the continental civilizations that might have emerged, from the radically different technologies they would have developed to the alien psychology that would have shaped their relationship with existence itself, all of it hinges on one simple geological fact: the supercontinent broke apart. But here's what should keep you awake tonight thinking. The breaking of Pangea wasn't some inevitable cosmic plan. It was the result of specific thermal currents in the Earth's mantle, particular patterns of heat and pressure that could have developed differently. The forces that split our world into separate continents were powerful, yes, but they weren't predetermined. Which means that in some parallel version of reality, perhaps just a few quantum fluctuations away from our own, those thermal currents moved differently. The mantle convection patterns shifted slightly. The geological stresses found different release points, and Pangea held together, creating a world where everything we've discussed tonight actually happened. Somewhere in that alternate reality, humans who are biologically identical to us developed completely different minds, completely different relationships with challenge and discovery, completely different approaches to cooperation and conflict. They mastered technologies we never needed to invent, while never developing capabilities we take for granted. They created civilizations that could coordinate activities across continental distances while never experiencing the joy of discovering a new land across unknown waters. And those alternate humans, if they could somehow look across the dimensional divide and see our world, would be just as amazed by us as we are by them. They would wonder how we ever developed the courage to sail into the unknown, how we learned to navigate by stars over featureless oceans, how we created the diversity of cultures and languages that emerged from our geographical separation. To them, our world would seem impossibly fragmented and chaotic. The idea that humans could be separated by vast oceans and develop completely different approaches to fundamental questions would seem as alien to them as their continental unity seems to us. They might see our diversity as weakness, our exploration as reckless wandering, our independence as dangerous fragmentation. But they would also envy us in ways they might not even understand. The excitement of not knowing what lies beyond the horizon, the creativity that comes from collision between different ways of thinking, the resilience that emerges from having multiple approaches to the same problems, the simple joy of discovery that has driven so much of human achievement. What's profound about this thought experiment isn't just that it shows us an alternative path human development might have taken. It's that it reveals how much of what we consider essential about human nature is actually contingent on the specific geographical conditions we happen to face. The wanderlust that drives us to explore new places, that emerged because there were new places to discover. The diversity of human cultures that we celebrate, that developed because geographical barriers allowed different groups to evolve independently. The technologies that define our modern world, many of them emerged from the specific challenges of crossing oceans and dealing with geographical separation. Strip away those geographical conditions, and you get humans who are just as intelligent, just as creative, just as capable of cooperation and achievement, but who express all of those qualities in completely different ways. Ways that might be more effective in some areas and less effective in others, but that would be recognizably human in their core drives and aspirations. This should be both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it shows us that many of the things we're most proud of as a species aren't inevitable expressions of human nature, but contingent responses to specific environmental challenges. Inspiring because it shows us that human adaptability and creativity are far more flexible and powerful than we usually imagine. What strikes me most about this entire exploration is that it forces us to confront a truth we rarely acknowledge. We're not living in the inevitable world. We're living in one possible world among countless others that could have been just as real, just as valid, just as human. The choices our planet made for us through continental drift shaped not just where we live, but who we became as thinking beings. And that should change how you see everything around you.